Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Secretary, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, we appreciate you being here today. What's your sense of this meeting with Obama and Putin later today?
Well, they haven't talked to each other in a couple of years, and obviously the Russians are under sanctions from what they were doing in Ukraine. What is interesting is that we have some common purpose in terms of trying to defeat ISIL. And that is a huge threat to everything that's going on in Syria and the people. Where we disagree is on support for Assad and the government there, the regime, and how changes need to come about. So I imagine that this will be a very frank and important meeting, and both the presidents will be trying very hard to express their views clearly about what we overlap on and what we disagree on.
It's hard to trust what Russia's priorities and agenda is with this equipment on the ground in Syria. I know that he was basically saying no to boots on the ground, but Russia has been building up its military there in Syria.
Well, they have been there for quite some time, and the Russians have been trying for decades to really have a very strong, influential role in the Middle East. They have had a relationship with Syria, with Assad's father and him now, and they have a port there, so they are delivering more equipment there. I think it's very hard to figure out exactly how much they're bringing in, and I think that there is some suspicion about that. But I do think, and this is what happens, is you try to find some common interest on dealing with what we see as a real threat, which is ISIL and what they're doing to the people.
I want to get back to ISIL because I know you have some passionate views on this, and I want to get your take on what the solution is. But let's talk about the op-ed that you wrote in the Boston Globe this morning about the migrant crisis in Europe. You write that the U.S. must do more. Tell us what you'd like to see happen when we look at these horrible pictures of thousands of people trying to cross borders.
Well, I think Americans have always been very generous about taking in people that need to leave their country. I'm an immigrant. I came here with my family in 1948. Didn't have a terrible story about barbed wire or boats or anything, but the bottom line is I am a very grateful American. We do have the capability of absorbing more people. Yesterday, I saw the King of Jordan, this is a small country right on the front lines, and the number of immigrants they have and refugees in camps from not only Syria but Iraq and Palestine is as if the United States had 60 million refugees. Wow. And so we're talking about, I've been suggesting, and Secretary Kerry's been talking about increasing our number at least to 100,000. I think we could do it.
I think you make a great point about King Abdullah. King Abdullah and Queen Rania have really been a model for the world. They've done really great humanitarian work. But when you say 100,000 migrants to come into this country, how do we know that these are actually migrants and not ISIS dressed in migrant clothing?
Well, we do have ways of vetting people, and the process of bringing the people in is something that can be and should be organized in a way. But I don't think we can constantly be operating on what I call the fear factor. I think that we are a humanitarian nation. There is a way to vet people to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, but at the end of the day, the world has to come together to help this situation. I mean, ISIL is driving these people out of their homes in Syria, in Afghanistan. What's the answer? What's the solution to defeating ISIL?
Well, I think what you've said is absolutely true. It's a common problem. It's not just ours or the Europeans or the neighboring countries. ISIL came into existence because of vacuums of authority. They are people who live in, 5 centuries ago. They want to establish a caliphate. I think what we have to do is to defeat it, and which is why there is a welcome in terms of having the Russians be helpful, as well as the regional partners that we have there. The other thing is we have to recognize this isn't going to happen overnight. The conditions that create that people want to have a different way of living, I think we have to help economically and politically, and we have to make sure that they are not able to create this kind of sense that they need to go back to the 15th century. We cannot put up with ISIL, and I think that that is a longer-term issue we have to deal with.
Has the U.S. been doing enough? I mean, there's a lot of criticism and debate over the U.S.'s leading from behind strategy, and that's one of the criticisms of the fact that we have not been able to defeat ISIL yet.
Well, one of the hard parts is that it's always it's necessary to figure out how this all happened. And I know people get tired of Democrats blaming Republicans for the war in Iraq, but the war in Iraq is part of what this is about, that created this vacuum that then has spread into other countries. And President Obama, I think, has lived up to what he promised, is that he would end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he has, in fact, made clear that we would be helpful in Syria. I do think that this is a long-term problem where we have not generally, I think, Americans don't want to be involved there, and yet I do think that American influence there and importance is very important to every way. Israel is our ally and friend, and we want to be able to have its back, and so it's one of the most complex situations I've ever seen in the Middle East, and ISIL is the major problem for us to deal with.
Many people will say when President Obama made the decision to pull the troops out of Iraq, that's when ISIL really became as powerful as it is today.
That's a more complicated story because the Iraqi government did not want to have a status of forces agreement, and that began to be negotiated in the Bush administration. But I think that President Obama I think has done everything he can to try to help stabilize the Iraqi government and to have somebody as prime minister who is more willing to accept some of the Sunnis into the government. That's part of the problem. You know, most Americans knew nothing about Islam, much less the difference between the Shia and Sunni. So what is happening is we are watching a historic fight between two aspects of the Muslim religion, and the other between Iranians and Saudis, and Persians and Arabs, and it is a very complex story. And the U.S. can help, but not alone. And what President Obama is trying to do, and I fully support this, is to get the region more involved. It's not a matter of leading from behind. It's a matter of leading with partners. And that's what President Obama is doing.
Let me get